Hello! Today we're going to talk a little bit about the Dorian mode, which I think for beginning improvisers is one of the best modes to start out in, simply for the fact that it is extremely forgiving. Every single note within the mode can be sustained against the chord, so it's stable enough to be a melody note, basically, and not a note like this, B flat over A, that just needs to resolve. You hear that unstable, tense sound. If I just hang out on that note, I would definitely run the risk of sounding like I don't know what the hell I'm doing. Alright, so today we're going to be using the A Dorian mode, which is the second mode of the G major scale. If you don't know what modes are, you might want to take a little time to figure that out. It's not too difficult, but if you do, please stay with me. Even if you don't, you could probably figure it out from this lesson. Alright, so the second mode of the G major scale is the A minor, A Dorian mode. The A Dorian mode is simply the G major scale, starting on the note A and moving up to the note A. The intervals within the mode are 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, 6, flat 7, 8. Now, let's put that thing I said to the test about all the notes being consonant. I have a backing track with an A minor chord playing, and I'm just going to kind of lay on every single note in the scale and let it hang. And we're going to see if there's anything that's too nasty, but my guess is there isn't. Starting on the root. Second degree. Third. Fourth. Fifth. Sixth. Seventh, eighth, ninth. Alright, so I think every single one of those notes sounded pretty cool. One of the most tense notes within that would be the sixth, which is the F sharp. It's the note right before the seventh degree, the flatted seventh degree. But that's actually a really cool note, and you hear it a lot in funk music. They'll add it to a minor chord to just give it a little bit of tension inside of it. Alright, so that's basically why it's a great mode to work with. You don't have to worry about being in the right place at the right time. You can experiment with different arpeggios found within the mode over that one chord. You can really start to learn a lot about tension and resolution. So that being said, we're just going to take a look at a couple ways to play the scale to make it a little more interesting than just going through the scale forward and backwards, like so. The position I'm using is kind of a hybrid position. It just has 3 notes per string, and it starts on the 6th string. It goes fret 3, 5, and 7. That's G, A, B. Then C, D, E, which is 3, 5, and 7 on the 5th string. On the 4th string, it's 4, 5, 7, which is F sharp, G, A. Then 4, 5, 7 again on the 3rd string. That's B, C, D. Then I shift my first finger up to the 5th fret on the 2nd string, E, and I go E, F sharp, G. That's 5, 7, 8, and then 5, 7, 8 again on the 1st string, and those are the notes A, B, and C. So that's just one of the positions of the scale. There are tons of hybrid position. Everybody kind of finds their own favorites, and I don't think many players use just one. Alright, so here we go. We're going to play the scale just forwards and backwards over the backing track just to listen to it one more time. And then we're going to talk about ways to break that scale up and make it sound a little more interesting. Alright, so I did kind of break it up in a couple spots there, force of habit. But we're going to take a look at some of the things you can do with a scale to make it sound more interesting. One of those things is to break the scale up into intervals. This can be a little tricky. You definitely have to get the scale under your fingers. basically to the point when you can talk to somebody and hold a conversation and just let your fingers run over the scale without thinking about where they're going, you know, in the back of your head, so to speak. But once you do that, you can start to mess with it and play with intervals. One of the more common intervals, usually the one people start with, is thirds. Thirds happen to be the same interval that you use to build chords, so they tend to be very melodic. A third is essentially diatonic third, meaning within the same scale, within the same key. A third is when you hit one note in the scale and then skip the note, the next note from that, and hit the next note either up or down. So I kind of explained that strangely, but it's every other note. So in the G major scale, or the A Dorian mode, same thing, G, A, and B are the first notes in this position that we're using here. If I wanted to play a third, I would skip A and I would go right to B from G. So I would go G, B, or fret 3 to fret 7. Now if I keep doing that, starting on every note within the scale, I wind up with a thirds pattern and it sounds cool. So I could start on G and skip to B. Then I go to the second note in the scale, which was A, and I hit A, I skip B, and go right to C. So I have G, B, A, C, B, D, C, E, D, F sharp, E, G, F sharp, A, G, B, and so on and so forth. You wind up with this really cool sounding little melodic idea. Anything you do ascending, you should be able to do descending as well, meaning going backwards. And that's a really cool way to break the scale up and, you know, wind up with a couple more options. Now those are just third intervals. There's a lot of cool intervals. There's fourths, which the same principle applies as in thirds. You hit a note, and then you hit a note 4 notes away in the scale, counting the one you're on. So say I wanted to play a fourth down from G. G, all right, I want to say I started here, doesn't really matter. G, F sharp, E, D. So G and D, they're a fourth apart. So that's the type of sound you get. Or you wind up with this really interesting sound. So that's another interval. There's a sixth interval. That can also sound interesting. Now once I get these intervals under my fingers, alright, this is sixths, which, you guessed it, is hitting a note and then hitting a note 6 notes away from that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Alright? And then doing the same thing for every note in the scale, ascending or descending. Once I start working an interval like that and get it under my fingers, I start inverting the intervals. Now this can be a little tricky. Again, you got to get the intervals under your fingers before you start doing this. So there is kind of a process. But once I do that, I basically take an interval, maybe every other or even every third pattern, and I flip it backwards. So if I'm ascending in sixth, ascend, ascend, instead of ascending on that third one, I would go and then turn it backwards. And you wind up with a really interesting sound. Let's take a listen to that. I'm going to do the same thing with my fourths. And this can really kind of start to give you an interesting, really angular sound. So there you go. You can do the same thing with thirds. Any single interval. You can do Seconds, well, seconds actually is just playing through the scale like this, so don't listen to me on that one. But you can do it with thirds, fourths, fifths, sixths, sevenths, octaves, ninths, and it can sound really, really cool. And obviously the wider the intervals get apart, the more angular and crazy it sounds. So that's a really interesting thing to do with scales. There is a process to it. First you got to get the scale under your fingers. Then you got to work the interval, just forwards and backwards. And once that interval is under your fingers, that's when you can start flipping it around. And it takes a little work, but it is totally worth it. The last thing I'm going to talk about is doing sequences. Sequencing is just moving through a scale, a specific number of notes, in a specific pattern. So that's a very vague explanation, probably not the one you would find in a music theory dictionary. But I can show you, and that's good enough, I think. So say I start on the first note in the scale. If I were to do a 4-note sequence, I would go 4 notes ahead from the first note in the scale. Then start on the second note in the scale, go 4 notes ahead. Then start on the third note in the scale, continue, so on and so forth until I run out of notes, I guess. So here's what a sequence would sound like in A Dorian, which is also the G major scale. So. And then descending. So that's a really interesting way to play through a scale as well. It can give you a really kind of nice building of melody. It can get old too, just like any of these things. But something you can do with those, say we have a 4-note sequence like that, once we get tired of hearing it in that 16th note rhythm I was just doing there, 1 E and a 2 E and a, you can change the underlying rhythm to triplets, and you wind up with a polyrhythmic sound of 4 against 3, and that can be really interesting. That would sound something like this: 1, 2, 3, 4. Or let's see. That can really break it up, start to make it sound cool. The key to any pattern, any sequence that you use, is to try and not do it so obvious that the listener catches on to it. And, it takes a little while to do that, but once it starts meshing with your other ideas, you'll be able to. That's it on the Dorian mode today, and most of that stuff applies to any mode. The reason I picked Dorian, in fact, all that stuff applies to any mode. The reason I picked the Dorian mode is because it is very forgiving and will allow you to play without having to worry about making a bad sound. Alright, that's it. I hope you enjoyed that. Thanks.